Hi, my name's Dr. Adam Booth, and welcome to the last of our lockdown editions of Quantum Source. Hence, I thought I'd get a bit spruced up to mark the occasion. Of course, the irony is that me and Jane are actually now quarantined for the last of these quarantine sources, having contracted a mild case of COVID-19. But there you go, that's the realities of living with a global pandemic. But anyway, moving on. Early in the lockdown, we were looking to the past and we were looking at the way that alcohol is used in stressful situations or when it's in restricted supply, say within the Prohibition era. But now, in this final quantum source, we're definitely looking forward to the future. A lot of cities around the world during the lockdown reported that there was generally better air quality, probably because people's places of work were closed or they were working from home and they weren't using their cars quite as much. And so it's difficult to get away from the fact that the internal combustion engine is responsible for damaging air quality in cities. And maybe this is something we can take away into the post-COVID, post-lockdown world, that with different technologies we could maybe improve air quality, reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And one potential solution is through the adoption of electric vehicles. Now, electric vehicles are not without their controversies, but today's speaker is an expert in electric vehicle technology, and hopefully she can debunk some of the myths for us. She is Rachel Lee. She's a PhD researcher at the University of Sheffield in the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering, and we're going to give her a bell in just a minute. But as always, there's a recommendation that fascinating facts are best served with something refreshing, and for this final quantum source, it's the classic drink by which you bring down the curtain on a night and you can reflect on everything that you did. I'm just going to be sipping on a nice glass of brandy, so you get yourself something nice and we'll give Rachel a call. Cheers. And hello Rachel, good afternoon, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks Adam. Nice to see you. Dressed very smartly there.
Yeah, I thought it is only appropriate to give Quantum Source the send-off that it deserves.
Good, yeah.
Now, what source could you recommend for a big send-off?
Well, you know, I'm based at Sheffield. In fact, I did my first degree at Sheffield, so there really can be only one source, Henderson's Relish. Making
its second appearance on Quantum Source, I would say, so yeah.
Unsurprisingly, I suppose, being one of the finest sources ever.
A controversial statement, and maybe not the only controversial statement we'll be making in this particular call, given that some of the reluctance to accept electric vehicle technologies, yeah?
Yeah, I would say so. They're beginning to take off now, but there's a lot of doubt, I think, in many people's minds.
Right, okay. Now, I would say, for full disclosure here, that Rachel has partly cast me in the role of the troll. So I've been supplied with a few of the questions that a lot of the doubters often put to Rachel. So I'm going to be interspersing them through Rachel's presentation and see what she's got to say about it. But with that in mind, Rachel, maybe we can kick off and we can share your screen.
So yeah, I'm going to talk about electric vehicles and where could we go. So I'm currently doing some research at the University of Sheffield, supported by these fine people. So I'll crack on. And the first thing I wanted to talk about really was EV growth, and I guess a little bit about, are we doing the right thing? Are we heading in the right direction with it? So this first slide here just shows a little bit about the growth of electric vehicles, really since they came in. So in about 2003, we saw our first hybrid type vehicles. That would be something like the Toyota Prius.
Right.
And then we've added to that with these plug-in hybrid type cars where you can actually plug in and charge the battery. And then more recently, the pure battery vehicles, things like the Nissan Leaf and the Teslas and so on, that have arrived more recently. And you can see that we've got an exponential growth there, but it is early days. Still only about 2.5% of cars on the road have any kind of drivetrain battery in them at all. But if you take a look at this table here, which comes from the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, you'll see there's been a huge fall in the sale of diesel and petrol cars this year. That's, of course, COVID-related issues. But if you look at the pure battery electric vehicles, you'll see that as of this data is to the end of July, we had a growth of 158% on sales from last year,
yeah,
which is really quite surprising.
Absolutely.
And you will also see that actually some of the other hybrids have continued to grow in that time, but cars really have taken off. And if you take a look at something that Bloomberg have done, they do an annual look at EV cars and batteries, and they reckon that by 2040 we'll have something like 55% of all new car sales will be electric. This is globally. And by then there'll be about 560 million electric vehicles on the roads. But of course, getting there is a challenge, and not everyone believes in it. And as I said, we do have some trolls around, and I can't imagine what kind of questions they might ask.
Well, it's funny you should say, because one question I did have here was that obviously, electric vehicles are just one solution, but there's plenty of other solutions, and it could be in cleaner fuels, it could be in the use of hydrogen technology.
Funnily enough, that was the first question I'd planned to answer. Surely hydrogen is the future is a question that lots of people suggest. So what I wanted to do here was quickly compare the energy use of a hydrogen car with that of an electric car, and see why I might believe that electric is the future. So this is a Sankey diagram. It shows energy flows in proportion to the width of the bars. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail with it, but I'm imagining a future here where it's 100% renewable. We want to drive our cars on renewable energy. So if we're going to make hydrogen from renewable energy, we have to use electrolyzers to make hydrogen, and they have an efficiency. So in our Sankey diagram here, this first big loss, which is the purple section, this is a loss from the system, is our electrolyzer, heat losses in the electrolyzer. In a perfect world, we might be able to use that to heat houses and so on if we put the electrolyzers in the right places. But the chances are they're not all going to be in the right place, so we'll get some losses there. So arriving at the wheel, we've got about 29 units of energy to drive our car. And we've lost something like 70 units of energy. If we compare that to a battery electric car, we've got a very different picture. So we're still generating renewables, 100 units of renewables. We're going to lose a bit in transmitting that renewable power to where we need it. And we'll actually lose a little bit more probably than in the hydrogen situation, because we need to get it to people's homes. So we're getting a bit further with it. But we end up with something like 73 units or 70-ish units of, these are not very precise figures, but that kind of order of magnitude, arriving at the car. And losses of only about 25, 30 units. So you can see immediately that our electric car is much more efficient from generation to wheel. And of course, that also means that to power our hydrogen fleet, we'd need to build 2.5 times many wind turbines or solar panels to make that work. So my view is that for personal transport, small vehicles, certainly, battery is the future. That may not be the case for big heavy vehicles where batteries weigh a lot and they're harder to make that work. So that's why hydrogen, I think, is the future. Over to my troll.
Well, I mean, you're suggesting there that we've already got the word renewable on the slide there. If we're talking about the adoption of vehicles to try and cut down CO2 emissions, then you're asking for more power to be generated here. So you're asking for more investment within renewable power as well. So how does that stack up? I mean, we've already got the infrastructure for non-renewable power, and fair enough, it's emitting CO2. But if we're actually going to make the world cleaner, then you're going to need more investment in renewable anyway, right?
Well, we will, but it's not quite as bad as you think. So I've stolen this rather nice chart from I've put a link to the website there, and it's a really good article on that website, nicely referenced and everything, that looks at this kind of issue about how much carbon do we save from electric cars. And what the chart there is showing is that the dark blue box at the bottom, that's the amount of embodied carbon that's actually present in the chassis of the car, the bodywork, all those kinds of things. And you can see that they're quite similar, whether it's a conventional car or an electric car. If it's an electric car, we need a battery. So we've got this light blue bit here, and there's embodied carbon in the battery. And we've got quite a big error bar on the blue line there. And that's partly because there are lots of different studies that say lots of different things. But it's also because it depends very much on where you make your battery. So if you're building your battery in a Tesla factory covered in solar panels, you can treat the electricity as being very low carbon. If you're building it in a factory in China powered by a coal-fired power station, you'll be at the other extreme. So that's why there's quite a bit of variability. And the orange part is then the fuel cycle. So that's about how we generate our electricity in the case of our electric car over here. Or in the case of our fossil fuel car here, it's about making fuel, about making petrol and transporting it to petrol stations. And what you see about the orange bar here is, of course, we can completely eliminate it. So if we're in Norway, it's all hydro, and there is no orange bar. And that's where we're heading in the future. Of course, the important thing to realise is that as we head that way, so these other two bars in our battery car will also reduce because we've got lower carbon intensity in the supply chain. That's also true of our conventional vehicles over here, our normal car and our hybrid car. But this grey bar we can't get rid of. That is the emissions from the tailpipe. And after about 100 years of developing this engine, that's the best we've managed to get to.
Wow.
Whereas we've only been doing this for 10 years or so. So the answer to me really is yes, they do save carbon, and they save carbon in almost every situation that you can use them in over their lifetime.
Okay. But then, of course, I also save carbon by not scrapping my existing car and just keeping it and carrying on running it, right?
Maybe. As it happens, have a look at this as well. So this chart here assumes that your existing car has no embodied carbon. You've already paid the debt. And you replace it with this new, in this case, it's a Nissan Leaf as an example, which is about 160 mile range. And you're going to drive the average UK distance per year, which is 7,800 miles. So what you see here is the grey bars are what your current car is producing each year. And you can see that after 4 years, actually, the carbon debt in the new car has been paid back. So it depends on your perspective on timescale, but basically after 4 years, you will be driving a clean car or a cleaner car. Most people actually only keep their car for about 4 years, but of course that car goes on to become someone else's car and replaces another diesel or petrol car. So actually there is a benefit to swapping your old car for a battery car. Inevitably there are some downsides. We can't claim there are none. So I've just sort of tried to address a few of them in this table here. The first thing people often raise is the kind of environmental damage and humanitarian issues around mining lithium and the rare earth elements and things that we need to make our batteries with. I guess, that is true. That's a downside. Don't forget there are also downsides to oil extraction, as we frequently see. And I think it's also worth bearing in mind that these issues, they exist for your mobile phone, for your laptop, for your power tool battery and so on, granted at a smaller scale. But we do need to address them anyway. And one of the things that I think the growth of EVs doing is shining a spotlight on that. And certainly people like VW are claiming sort of carbon neutrality and that they're not causing these problems with their new EVs.
So it's not to say that two wrongs make a right, but when you get increased consumer demand and that increased spotlight, you can actually start to do something about it.
Yes, I think so. And I think it's also, in a sense, things like your mobile phone, everyone is benefiting from, and they want to perhaps not mention the downsides to that.
Sure.
But with an electric vehicle, they still haven't changed their mind and said, "I like this; it's better for me." So that people want an excuse. So it's a nice excuse to use. So there's also the physical limitations on material supply for lithium and so on, and that certainly is an issue, and it's doubtful whether we could convert every car in the world with our current known resources. But we're already seeing researchers and manufacturers addressing this, and I think it's true that Tesla's new Model 3 that they make in China actually doesn't have any cobalt in the battery. It's a different battery, for example. And we've got researchers looking at sodium-ion batteries rather than lithium-ion. They're not there yet. The energy density isn't there, but there's a lot of sodium in the world.
Right.
So it's a potential solution. There's also what happens at the end of life of these batteries. They do contain lots of nasties, and we somehow need to deal with them. The first thing I would say is that they do have a very long life. So it's actually another troll question that you could have asked me. It'll only last 3 years.
Actually, I've been a bit uncomfortable with my role of the troll. It's not the scientist in me is struggling to get out.
Yeah, well, that's probably a good feeling to have occasionally. But I guess the way I would have answered that question is that people often think about their mobile phone and think, oh, my mobile phone only lasts 3 years and then I have to throw it away because the battery's no good. But of course, you actually pretty much cycle your mobile phone fully every day. It's flat at the end of the day. You plug it in at night and recharge it again. So over your 3 years, that's something like 1,000 to 1,500 cycles. Now my car will do 250 miles on a charge. So 1,000 to 1,500 cycles of that is 250,000, 300,000 miles.
Yeah.
And we're actually expecting Elon Musk to announce the 1 million mile battery in a couple of weeks' time. So I actually expect the batteries will outlast the cars. And we're already seeing some old EV batteries being used in a second life for static storage in homes and that kind of thing. So that's useful because that actually gives us time to develop the capacity to recycle these batteries. And what's good to know is that there are already places in Europe that can recycle over 70% of a car lithium-ion battery. And that particular plant that I've looked at, they're aiming to get to 92% recycling rate, which is pretty good, really. Another issue is that EVs, they don't solve all our emissions problems. And one of the things we need to think about is particulate tyre wear from get that right the right way, particulates from tyre wear. And then there's a couple of other things which I'm going to look at in a bit more detail, and that's some social equity issues around EV ownership and charging, and also this question about EV charging. We said it's okay at a national level from a power station perspective, but actually there are some issues if we don't control it properly. So that's what I wanted to just sort of move on and address. So EV charging, and I'm going to look at it a little bit from the system network operator's perspective here. But the first thing is, and this is kind of my interest really, it's all about behaviour really. So when we move to an electric car, we have to think differently. The way that we charge is likely to be different. And there's some opportunities from this, but we'll only get those opportunities delivered if we can actually change the way that people behave and people want to use and charge their car. Before we get there, it's time for you to participate a bit more actually, Adam.
Right.
Because you may not be normal.
We can take a vote on that from the Quantum Source audience.
Okay, we'll do that. I suppose the first question is, do you have a car?
Yes, I do.
Okay, where is your car now?
It's outside of this room, just on the road in front of the house.
Okay, well that's great. You are actually quite normal.
Hey! I always knew it.
So there's a very useful set of data called the National Travel Survey. It's literally over 10,000 people are sampled on a regular, ongoing basis about their travel habits, and they record a detailed travel diary. And that means we can work out where people are, when and how they're using their cars, and so on. And what the chart on the right does is it divides it up into time that a car is spent at work in brown, at home in green, elsewhere in grey. The survey breaks it down a bit more by lumped it together there, and actually driving in yellow at the top.
Yeah.
You may have seen that figure of cars are parked 95% of the time. You may have heard that quoted, and that's where it comes from. You can see that cars are parked most of the time. And of course, an interesting thing in the post-COVID world is will that change? Will, in fact, we see that brown bit diminish a bit as people spend more time at home, and the grey bit certainly at the moment as well.
Yeah, so it's not just kind of like the technological challenge of EVs. It's you're kind of talking about the societal evolution that could go on with them as well.
We are, yes, and that that parked 95% of the time thing is a thing that business folk say, well, what a waste of that asset.
Yeah, right.
Although sometimes I'm not entirely sure. I mean, my kettle is probably used less than 5% of the time, but I'm not going to have a shared kettle service, I don't think. If we were to adopt a kind of no behaviour change, or as limited a behaviour change as possible with electric cars, then we'd have a picture that looks a bit like this complicated thing I've shown here. But up in this top chart is the state of charge of our battery as an orange line. And this is like the fuel tank level in your car.
Right.
So it's just going to drop over time, and then you'll get to a point, maybe it's about 20% charge, and you find a rapid charger, which is the equivalent of a fuel pump.
Yeah.
And you top it back up again. I've only shown it going to 80% because it's hard to rapid charge a battery above 80%. You start to cause thermal problems and potential degradation. And then you'd let it slowly discharge again as you use it. And typically, that might be a once weekly thing that you might do at a supermarket or somewhere. But there are some problems with that. What you tend to find, and this is actually mapping journeys from the National Travel Survey, is that you do tend to get charging overlapping with existing system peaks in the early evening. So that could be problematic. And charging these batteries requires quite high powers. So currently they tend to be in the 50 to 150 kilowatt range. So perhaps that's not the solution. Maybe there'd be a lot of charging at home. Something like 65% of the population actually have access to off-street parking and could potentially in the future charge at home. So this slide here is not actually about charging, but I just to show how this sort of works. This little chart here is my own house profile over a week, my electricity demand. These spikes are when I've been making myself a cup of coffee.
That's when you've been sharing your kettle, right?
That's right. And if we take around 100 houses or so that might be on a typical feeder, and we average those out, we get a profile that looks like this one down here. Because it gets averaged, we see lower peaks. And what we see is an early morning peak here. It drops off during the day, and we get our evening peak, and then overnight it drops quite substantially. So what happens if we just come home and we just I've added another little tag there about post-COVID behaviour. That may shift that again, and we may see less of a dip in the middle of the day, for example. So what if we just come home and we kind of adopt an uncontrolled strategy? We just plug our car in and charge as soon as we get home. Again, I've taken about 100 vehicles from the National Travel Survey, and I've overlaid them onto our domestic profile. And what you see is that the peak sort of aligns with the existing peak.
Everyone comes home in the evening, they're making tea at the same time as they're charging up the car.
Exactly, yeah. And so what's going to happen is, although nationally the system could probably cope with that because you're seeing a fall off in commercial demand and things at the same time, our local distribution systems tend to be designed just to meet this green area. And certainly they're designed around 1 kilowatt typically peak, so we're going above that. So it could be problematic for our local distribution systems. They may not be able to handle it. So, what about if we tried to do it overnight? Supposing we all came home and put our car on a timer to charge it overnight. So that's actually what I certainly used to do with my old EV. And here is my actual charging profile for a week. You can see it shoots up overnight, charges the car on a cheap tariff. The problem then is that if everyone does it, those peaks will all happen at the same time, particularly because our cars are connected to the internet and even their clocks are set the same. So, so we could get a horrible spike in demand, and that would be really difficult actually to manage at a national level to pick up that demand so quickly. So no, that's not really a solution either. But actually there are some quite simple solutions. This is a little algorithm that I programmed in, and it basically solves the problem. There's no clever communication between cars or substations or power stations here. This is just an in-car algorithm. One of the problems with this, again coming back to behaviour, is that this now requires you and I as electric car drivers to trust that algorithm to have my car charged in the morning. And it also requires the network operators and system operators to trust that algorithm not to deliver spikes in demand. So we've got some behavioural things to overcome with this kind of solution. But nevertheless, you can see it can be done. It's not impossible. But beyond this sort of simple charging, is there something else that EVs could do for us? Could they actually help us rather than hinder us, is the question. And this is where something called vehicle-to-grid comes in, maybe something you've heard of.
I can't say that I have, but I'm going to put two and two together and say this is actually a bit like when the sun is shining and those with solar panels on their roof are actually supplying the grid. Can we do something like this with the vehicle?
That's exactly it. I'm guessing that the car parked outside is not electric.
No, it's not.
Good. So I can ask you, why wouldn't you buy a pure EV today? Is it just cost? Is it range? Is there not the right choice of vehicles? Can you not charge at home? What would be your reason, Adam?
I think it's probably the fourth one. So I have on-street parking. So I don't really fancy the idea of trailing an electric lead out of the front door into the car. That's probably the main one. And then I am also a little bit stingy, so there's a purchase cost thing as well.
Yeah, okay.
Range and choice. I mean, range, most of the time I actually cycle into the university when I'm not working from home. And so range I don't think is a big issue for me. And choice, it's not like I'm particularly concerned by like style and things. As dapper as I look at the moment, it's not like a priority for me. So it's probably the charging issue. Yeah.
Okay. So that's a particular challenge for people in terrace houses. There are some solutions coming up. Things like lamppost charging is already happening in London. And so on. But let's imagine that EVs are priced the same as current vehicles. They are heading that way. They're getting cheaper. And let's assume that this kind of rapid charging is also ubiquitous. You can charge anywhere you like. So maybe your local supermarket might have one, and when you do your weekly shop, you could charge. What's the sort of minimum range that you would want your car to have, do you think?
Well, I guess that for all that when I do take the car into the university, it's just a short drive over to the uni. Probably the more use that I get out of the car is for sort of like mid to long journeys when I might go to visit family elsewhere in the country. And so if I think my parents in Stoke-on-Trent, I go to see them, probably 200 miles would be what I'd want.
Okay, that's a pretty good answer. Because actually, the studies and surveys that have been done do tend to come back with 200 to 300 miles as the common distance, and actually that makes quite a bit of sense. And I'll take you through why that is. But it does raise the interesting question about how much energy is actually going to be stored in all these batteries if we've got cars that are doing typically 200 to 300 miles on a charge. It actually works out that you need something like a 75 kilowatt hour battery to give you that kind of range in a car. That will give you a fully charged range of about 250 miles and an 80% range of about 200 miles, the 80% being important from how quickly you can charge and that kind of thing. So I actually have an EV with a 64 kilowatt hour battery, and it will do that in summer. It will do 250 miles on a motorway at 70 miles an hour, but it probably wouldn't do it in winter. It would probably be down about 200, 220 in those sorts of conditions.
That's just kind of like a battery efficiency with temperature thing.
It's mostly to do with battery efficiency with temperature. It's also that you're having to heat your car. Things like it tends to be windier and wetter, and that there's all those issues crop up. So let's assume that we've got our battery at 75 kilowatt hours. I'm never going to allow the battery, when I'm using it in this vehicle to grid mode that we've talked about, to drop below a third of its charge. And that's because most people will want to have some buffer there. Most people are normally only doing 20 odd miles a day, so this is giving them 100 miles a day as a kind of safety buffer. And I'm going to assume that I'm never going to charge or discharge them at more than 2 kilowatts per vehicle, which is kind of in the range that our grid could probably cope with. And I'm also going to assume, and this is the bit that's terrible, that all cars are connected in this V2G mode when they're not being driven. But I'm just going to look at half of the cars for this sake, so it's really only half the cars being connected. And the chart just sort of compares the amount of energy stored and the amount of power that we can get from those things. You may have heard of Renewable. Have you heard of Renewable or not?
No, I don't think I have.
Oh, okay, that's good. So Renewable is a pumped hydro storage plant in North Wales. It's the biggest one we have in the UK. It's the thing that responds when the cup final is on and everyone gets up to make their cup of tea. And we like to think of it as massive, and indeed you can go to the visitor centre there, and it is massive. It's a huge power station, 1,800 megawatts, huge dams and things. But actually, if it was able to generate the UK's mean demand, which it can't, it would only be able to support that for about 15 minutes.
Right.
And in terms of what it can actually generate, it can generate maybe 3 or 4% of the UK's average demand. If we went to somewhere like a big old power station, Drax, now running on biomass predominantly, it could supply about 10% of the UK's mean demand. And if it could supply all of the UK's demand, it would be able to do it for about 14 hours. Sense in comparison. Half of our EV fleet, so 15 million cars, that could actually generate about 75% of the UK's mean power demand, at 2 kilowatts per car, and it could do it for nearly 20 hours. So it's huge compared to the kind of storage that we already have in the system. The capability is enormous, and that makes it exciting. So if we take a look at our electric cars, the grey area here is what's actually being consumed during the day by our electric cars in energy. So at the peak commuting period in the morning, about 10 gigawatts of power is being used within the car to drive the wheels, and it's emptying the battery. And the amount of connected capacity, if we assume that they're all connected when they're parked, actually looks like this. So we know that they're parked most of the time. So we've got quite a lot of capacity available if we assume it's available as vehicle to grid. So let's have a look at a week in the summer. And this is based on a future demand curve. So this is our UK's electricity demand, varying between about 20 and 40 gigawatts between overnight and daytime. And let's try and meet that demand. Oh, magical! Lots of colours appear. but I'll take you through it quite quickly. So this purple area is our base generation. There's things like nuclear, some biomass, that kind of thing in there. I'm assuming we've got no coal left, and there's virtually no gas in this. We've added enough wind and solar to run about our cars over the year, so the average output over the year. But what that means is that there are going to be times when we've got too much wind and solar and not enough wind and solar. So for the first 3 days of this week, we've actually got a windy period. And we're generating, here where we're above the red line, we're generating a bit too much power. Our solar comes on and we're generating more than we need. So we're going to use that to charge our cars. And this area here is the area that's being used to charge the cars. And I've arbitrarily assumed that our cars start at 50% state of charge.
Okay.
And we see that the charge is kind of gradually going up over the first 3 days, whilst we've got excess power. Even though we're using them, it is still going up because we're generating more power than we can use. And then after the third day, the wind drops off, and we now want our cars to support the grid. And this dark blue area is our EVs discharging to support the grid. And that happens for a couple of days here. And then we turn back into this situation where we've got an excess of renewables and we're starting to charge again. And actually, our cars manage to support the grid for a day and a half before we need anything else.
Right.
And this red area is when we need something else to come in and back us up there. That's been what my area of research is, and I'm just going to sort of finish off with this, really. So it's about understanding the potential. And what I've been doing is building something called an agent-based simulation. So agents are, they're independently acting but linked operators. And it's a bit like SimCity, if you want to think about it that way. And each agent in the model follows some predetermined rules. So some are very deterministic, so like refuel when tank low, for example. Some are almost deterministic, so we've got a daily commute pattern, for example, that comes from the National Travel Survey. It's almost because actually there are random journeys inserted in there as well to try and affect that trip that you make to your parents or
right, yeah.
And then you've got some more random things, which perhaps are things like government policy in the world we live in.
Whatever that means.
Don't know. But obviously you've got breakdowns and that kind of thing that come in there. And these agents are actually, certainly the people agents in the model, are influenced to differing degrees by other agents. So their purchasing decisions are affected by their peer group and by car maker advertising and government policy and so on. And the result is you get some kind of emergent behaviour. So it's a pattern arising from the individual behaviour. And it's a bit like what we saw earlier with individual household demands resulting in some kind of pattern that emerges from it. So the way the model works is I have my driver, they're driving along in their car, they're quite happy, and then something will happen in the model. So maybe their car starts breaking down too frequently and they become dissatisfied. So they'll then use all of those things to look at the car market and make some kind of decision about what they're going to buy. And let's assume this person's bought an EV. That doesn't necessarily happen in the model. Most of the time it doesn't at the moment. But we'll assume they've bought their EV and they're now happy again. But if they buy an EV, then they're now faced with another option, which is they've got different ways they could charge their EV. So they could take the none, just plug in when you get home thing. They could use a time of use tariff. They might have this vehicle to grid, all sorts of different options. They do all the same things. And eventually we end up with this same kind of idea of what's really available in the market, this vehicle to grid. And that's the idea behind this kind of modelling, is trying to go from a theoretical to a practically what you might actually achieve. And some of the things you can get out of this, I'm not going to look at this in a great deal of detail, but is things like locational demand forecasting. So we know where these people live and the types of social category that they're in, for example. So I've divided these up here into a hard-pressed category, multicultural metropolitans, people who live in their city centre apartments and that kind of thing. Our suburbanites, need no explanation, and rural residents. And over time, so this is running up to about 2040, we can see that the adoption of the cars increases. We see more EVs. This is this dotted line here. And we see more charging. So the colour is the level of charging at the people's households. But what you will see from this is that our hard press group, they adopt more slowly and they don't charge as much. They're not placing demands on the grid in the same way other people are. And down here, our rural residents, they actually produce the biggest peak. And they do this because they're driving further and there's more overlapping of charging actually when people get home. And actually, they tend to live in the weakest grid areas where there's more infrastructure costs. So that's quite interesting. And there's some other things around that. So, for example, at the moment, it doesn't really matter whether you're a Beckham or a Peckham, as I like to term them. You will pay the same price to fill your car up with petrol. If you're a Beckham, though, then you've got money. You can be an early adopter. That means you'll get access to lower running costs earlier. You do help the market develop, of course. You're paying more for the car. But you're going to drive network investment costs. But also you're going to access low-cost home charging, so you can get a cheap tariff at night to charge your car. And ultimately you'll be able to access things like this vehicle-to-grid and vehicle-to-home technology that I've been discussing just now. These have become available to you. If you're the Peckham, you live in your a block of flats or in even maybe a terraced house, dare I say, you may have a slightly different picture. So you may not be an early adopter of the technology because you haven't got the money to do that. So you can't access the lower running costs so early. Though you will benefit from cost reductions in the future. You're probably overpaying the network investment costs because you're paying even when you haven't got the car. You can't access low-cost home charging, and rapid charging is much more expensive, home charging. And you can't access these other services of where you can manage your house demand and that kind of thing. So there are some quite big issues, I think, that we need to think about from a social equity perspective. And then I just thought I'd finish with a few little takeaway messages. So first is EVs are coming, whether we like them or not. I think we recognise that filling up is unlikely to be at filling stations as a norm. That's not going to be what happens. Even for someone like yourself, you may have charging facilities at the university, for example. So maybe once a week you just go in, plug your car in and charge it for the day. Charging them is easy to handle with simple controls, but we do need control because it could cause problems otherwise. There's a huge storage capacity in our cars. It's available at essentially, it's almost zero capital cost. We do need some infrastructure to access it. But obviously that's good in terms of cost. It's good in terms of the environment because we don't need to build separate batteries and so on. But the access to that and the ability of to use it is going to be very dependent on enabling cars to do it, because not very many of them can do that at the moment, and the chargers themselves to do it. So that's one question. But the other thing is this human behaviour question. We need people to think differently about how they use their cars and how they charge them. It's possible that we could have almost free fuel for people with flexibility. That may or may not be a good thing. But certainly you can charge at very low cost when there's excess renewables, and we could then potentially export at high value when there's a shortage of renewables. But those things do raise these kind of equity questions because they're not going to be available to everyone. And we perhaps need to think about how we might invest in community charging hubs, maybe how we link street charges to home accounts and that kind of thing to enable people to benefit. But ultimately, hopefully, we can find some kind of cost savings for all consumers out of it, because we end up with lower capital investment if we do that. And that's kind of me, really.
Cool. Well, thanks very much, Rachel. If I get you to unshare the screen. I love how it just speaks both to the technical challenge and the societal challenge as well. And thanks very much. It's a really good place to end the Quantum Source Lockdown series on, actually. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if I could ask a couple of questions. One of them is a trip back into my experience as a troll, and the other is a bit more sciencey. I'll start with the sciencey one. You say that I could potentially take my electric vehicle into the university once a week to charge it. Is the battery technology sufficient that I could then switch it on, start up the car in a month's time and expect that charge has been retained?
Yes, generally.
Right, okay.
So there is a little bit of self-discharge of batteries, and certainly Tesla owners sometimes complain a bit. But actually, that's, I think, because Teslas have a lot of stuff going on, even when the car's shut down, sort of security monitoring and things like that. Yeah. I personally have found with my own car that I can leave it for 2 weeks and there's no loss of charge at all. Okay. So, yeah, I don't think that'll be a big problem.
Okay. And then putting my my troll face back on.
Okay.
How much of the reluctance to adopt EVs do you think is because of people's kind of slightly macho concept about car ownership? And, they want a noisy V12 that when they put the foot down in a tunnel, they've got the sound of the engine roaring.
That is definitely an issue for some people, without a doubt.
Right.
I think what's quite interesting is when you look at the type of buyers of not so much electric cars in general, but Teslas in particular. Because Tesla has sold their car as much as an IT thing as a car. And it is a different sort of buyer. They do tend to be slightly geeky people who have Teslas. But the other people who buy Teslas are those performance people.
Right.
And that's because you can do 0 to 60 in a Tesla in 3.5 seconds or something like that, which is unachievable in most petrol cars. So I think they can be sold on performance to those people. And I'm also expecting app developers to come up with an app that will make your Nissan Leaf sound like a Ferrari.
Right. Yeah. Well, if you want to try driving Del Boy's 3-wheeler out of Peckham, then you could put that one on as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay. You customise the sound of your car. Excellent. Right. With that, Rachel, we'll leave you to your evening. What I would say to the Quantum Source audience out there is if you do have questions, then Rachel is very used to dealing with questions online. So you can post things to the Quantum Source Twitter account and I can send them Rachel's way. And I'm sure that she'd be able to give you an answer.
I'd love to, yeah.
Absolutely cool. Well, with that, Rachel, we'll say thanks again and you take care.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Cheers then. Bye-bye. So thanks very much to Rachel. Electric vehicles are coming, and so it's about time we got used to the idea and figured out how we can best incorporate them into our everyday lives. Now with that, I'm going to bring this lockdown series of Quantum Sources to a close. There are loads of other videos available for you through the Quantum Source Twitter and Instagram feeds. Keep your eyes peeled because we will be doing a few seasonal specials over the next few months, and then hopefully we can return to live Quantum Sources at Farsley's Constitutional Club before too long. But it just remains for me to say that I've been Dr. Adam Booth and this has been Quantum Source. It's a sauce made up of various ingredients, a variously spiced mix of contributions from 20 odd global academics, thanks very much to them, a big chunk of support from Farsley's Constitutional Club, a dash of funding from Leeds Inspired, thanks very much, and a huge amount of video expertise from Martin Wilson at Hardwired Video. But also, you have been excellent. Your comments and your engagement with the Quantum Sources over the summer has really kept me alive. So thanks very much. I really hope that I can see you before too long in the real world. Be cool, be safe, be awesome. Thanks very much. Cheers.